It's October 31st, 1501 AD, All Hallows Eve, the Vatican, a place most of us imagine as sacred, holy, and untouchable. The air is thick with the smell of incense. Candle flames flicker against marble walls, throwing shadows across the floor. And wafting through the corridors is the scent of something far less holy: roasted chestnuts. Now, if I told you that these chestnuts were not being prepared for a humble meal, but instead for a night of unimaginable scandal, would you believe me? Because on this night, hidden behind the walls of the papal palace, one of the most shocking events in church history unfolded. It would come to be known as the Banquet of Chestnuts, an evening so infamous that even 500 years later, historians still argue whether it was real or too outrageous to be true. But the details we do have come from one man, a quiet observer named Johannes Burchard. He was the papal master of ceremonies, and in his secret diary, Liber Notarum, he recorded what he witnessed that night with chilling precision. And here's where it gets almost unbelievable. The central figures of this night weren't anonymous nobles or wandering travelers. They were the Pope himself, Alexander VI, his powerful son Cesare Borgia, his daughter Lucrezia, and no fewer than 50 courtesans, carefully chosen for this private performance. Think about that for a second. The Vatican, the heart of Catholic faith, the place where millions looked for moral leadership, was hosting something that could make even the wildest Roman emperors blush. How does something like that happen? How does the most sacred institution of the time transform into a stage for one of the darkest scandals in religious history? Let's put ourselves in the shoes of someone there that evening. Imagine standing in those candlelit halls, hearing the echo of laughter where saints once prayed. Imagine watching as cardinals, nobles, and ambassadors gathered, not for prayer or ritual, but for spectacle. The sacred and the profane colliding under one roof. And those chestnuts, they weren't just roasted snacks. They became props in a twisted performance designed for shock, for indulgence, and perhaps for power. Some historians suggest that the symbolism of All Hallows Eve, the night when the boundary between the living and the dead was at its thinnest, wasn't an accident. That maybe Cesare Borgia chose this date deliberately. Was it a celebration of triumph? A way to flaunt his family's dominance? Or was it simply proof that corruption at the highest levels had gone completely unchecked? The truth is, no one can say for sure. What we do know is this: the Banquet of Chestnuts was more than just a night of debauchery. It was a mirror reflecting the deep moral decay of the Renaissance papacy. And it's precisely because it was recorded, because someone like Johannes Burchard was meticulous enough to write it all down, that we're able to glimpse into this hidden world, a world most people at the time would never have dared to imagine existed. So, as we dive into this story, I want you to think about something. What happens when those we trust the most, our spiritual leaders, our supposed moral guides, cross the line so completely that they become indistinguishable from the very corruption they're meant to fight? The Banquet of Chestnuts isn't just about scandal. It's about power, about human weakness, about the eternal tug-of-war between sacred duty and earthly desire. And as we peel back the layers of this forgotten night, we're not just uncovering history, we're uncovering a lesson that still echoes in our world today. Let's rewind the clock. Long before the scandalous Banquet of Chestnuts, before the Vatican halls echoed with laughter and shadows of corruption, there was a boy, born far from Rome, in a small Spanish town called Zatava, near Valencia. His name was Rodrigo de Borja, later known to history as Rodrigo Borgia. The date was January 1st, 1431, the very first day of a new year. An omen, perhaps, a life beginning just as the world turned a fresh page. But destiny had something far grander in store for this boy. He would rise from the dusty roads of Spain to the marble corridors of the Vatican, eventually seizing the papal throne itself, and not just as any pope, but as Alexander VI, arguably the most infamous pope in history. Now, here's the twist. Rodrigo didn't climb this ladder of faith through piety or deep devotion. No, his ascent was written in something older than holiness: family connections. His uncle, Alfonso de Borja, had already carved his path in the church. When Alfonso became Pope Calixtus III in 1455, Rodrigo's fate was sealed. At just 25 years old, he was elevated to the rank of cardinal deacon, not because of divine inspiration, but because of nepotism, the lifeblood of power in Renaissance Rome. And once Rodrigo had a taste of influence, he wanted more. He wasn't the meek or humble churchman you might expect. He was ambitious, charismatic, and deeply pragmatic. Imagine Rome in the late 15th century. By day, pilgrims knelt at gilded altars, their prayers rising like incense. But by night, the city transformed. The same streets became a marketplace of flesh, gold, and favors. Rodrigo understood this double life of Rome better than most, and he was determined to master it. He lived not as a man of God, but as a Renaissance prince. He accumulated wealth with the patience of a spider spinning its web, collecting benefices, titles, and privileges across Europe, like jewels in his treasury. He threw lavish banquets, lived in magnificent palaces, and kept mistresses whose beauty rivaled any noble woman of Rome. From these relationships came children who would later dominate the political stage: Juan, Cesare, and Lucrezia Borgia, names that history would never forget. But Rodrigo's lifestyle was not without its critics. Even in a city where scandal was practically breakfast gossip, his behavior raised eyebrows. Pope Pius II once wrote him a scathing letter, condemning his immoral conduct during his time in Siena. Think about that. If you're shocking Rome, a city already knee-deep in vice, you know you're pushing the limits. But did Rodrigo care? Not at all. To him, shame was a luxury, and morality was just another obstacle standing between him and the papal throne. And so, he set his eyes on the highest seat of power. The year was 1492, a year that would change not only Spain, with Columbus sailing across the Atlantic, but Rome as well. The papal conclave was held in the Sistine Chapel, beneath the same ceiling Michelangelo would one day transform into a masterpiece. 23 cardinals gathered to elect the new vicar of Christ. Behind closed doors, whispers turned to promises, promises to bribes, and bribes to open corruption. Gold exchanged hands like communion wafers. This was no divine election. It was politics at its rawest. When the smoke cleared on August 11th, Rodrigo Borgia emerged victorious. He had purchased the papacy. And just like that, the world met Pope Alexander VI. Now, you might expect the people of Rome to be horrified, but surprisingly, they celebrated. Fires blazed across the 7 hills, torchlight parades lit up the night, and triumphal arches rose in his honor. For a moment, it seemed like Rome believed it had found a strong, energetic leader who could restore order. And to be fair, at first, Alexander VI did just that. He imposed peace on streets plagued by violence. More than 200 assassinations had shaken the city in just a few months before his election. He established magistrates to maintain order and personally heard grievances from citizens every Tuesday. For a brief shining moment, the Pope who had bribed and schemed his way to the throne appeared to be the leader Rome desperately needed. But here's where history gives us a hard truth. Power doesn't create character, it reveals it. And Rodrigo Borgia's character, once revealed, would shock the world. So, here's the question I want you to think about. Was Rodrigo simply a product of his times, doing what everyone else was doing, just on a grander scale? Or was he the man who pushed the corruption of the Renaissance papacy past the point of no return? Because while the early days of his reign promised reform, the story of Alexander VI would soon spiral into ambition, excess, and scandal unlike anything the Vatican had ever seen. And it all began with that boy born in Spain, whose uncle opened the door to power, and who never stopped climbing until he sat on the throne of St. Peter. If Rodrigo Borgia's rise to the papacy shocked Europe, it was nothing compared to what came next. Because Pope Alexander VI didn't just build his legacy on wealth and power, he built it on his children. And those children weren't simply a family. They were pawns, knights, and even weapons on the bloody chessboard of Renaissance politics. Let's start with Juan, his eldest son. Rodrigo made him Duke of Gandia, showered him with wealth, and sent him to represent the family's growing influence. But Juan's reputation quickly soured. Rome whispered about his cruelty, his vices, and his incompetence as a commander. Then, in 1497, everything changed. One June morning, his body was found floating in the Tiber River, throat slit, 9 wounds carved into his flesh. The city erupted in rumors. Who killed him? Was it a political rival, a jealous husband, or perhaps his own brother, Cesare? To this day, no one knows for certain. But the murder sent shockwaves through Rome, and for a brief moment even Pope Alexander, the unshakable schemer, was struck with genuine grief. And that brings us to Cesare Borgia, the most infamous of them all. Originally destined for the church, Cesare was made a cardinal at just 18, but his ambition was far too great for robes and rituals. In 1498, he became the first cardinal in history to renounce his position. Why? Because Cesare was no priest. He was a soldier, a politician, and above all, a predator. His father backed him at every step, fueling his rise with papal money and power. Soon, Cesare carved out his own kingdom in central Italy, conquering the Romagna through a mix of warfare, diplomacy, and sheer terror. His methods were so ruthless and so effective that Niccolò Machiavelli later used him as the model for The Prince. Think about that. The very book that defines realpolitik. The cold logic of power was inspired by Cesare Borgia. And then there was Lucrezia. History often paints her as a seductress, a poisoner, the femme fatale of the Borgia family. But the truth is more complicated. Lucrezia was used, over and over again, as a political bargaining chip. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza was annulled when it no longer served the family's interests. Her second husband, Alfonso of Bisceglie, was later murdered. Many suspect Cesare's orders, once the alliance became inconvenient. Imagine that. Your very life and loves dictated not by your own heart, but by the calculations of family ambition. Was Lucrezia a willing accomplice in Borgia schemes, or a victim trapped in the web her father and brothers spun around her? Historians still debate that question. But one thing is clear. The Borgias turned family into politics, and politics into power. And as their ambition grew, so too did their corruption. The Vatican under Alexander VI wasn't just a spiritual center. It became a marketplace. Indulgences were sold like tickets to heaven. Church offices were auctioned to the highest bidder. Even the red hats of cardinals were up for sale. By the end of his reign, Alexander had appointed 47 new cardinals, each appointment swelling the papal treasury and fueling Cesare's war chest. And yet, for all the corruption, there was magnificence. The papal apartments became theaters of spectacle, lavish banquets, musical performances, political negotiations disguised as entertainment. Imagine cardinals and ambassadors dining alongside courtesans, their alliances cemented not in prayer, but in whispered deals over wine. To refuse an invitation from the Pope was dangerous. To accept was to be implicated in the decadence. The Vatican, once the holiest of places, had become a stage where the sacred and the profane danced hand in hand. Now here's the question. How does a family so drenched in scandal, so openly corrupt, still command loyalty, admiration, and even fear?
The answer lies in the nature of power itself. People in Renaissance Italy didn't just respect strength, they worshipped it. And the Borgias had strength in abundance. Juan may have fallen, but Cesare's sword carved out fear across Italy. Lucrezia, despite her suffering, became Duchess of Ferrara and one of the most admired women of her age. And Alexander VI, despite critics calling him the most depraved pope in history, held onto the papal throne for over a decade. It's easy to judge them now, to see their actions as monstrous. But let me ask you, if you lived in that world, where alliances shifted overnight, where poison might be in your next glass of wine, and where power meant survival, would you have acted differently? Because that's the true story of the Borgias. Not just a tale of corruption, but a reflection of human ambition at its rawest. A family that turned love into politics, faith into currency, and power into both their weapon and their downfall. When we think of history's great storytellers, we often imagine poets, philosophers, or fiery orators. But sometimes, the most important witness is the quiet one standing in the corner, writing everything down. That was Johannes Burchard. Burchard wasn't a pope, nor a powerful cardinal,
nor even a nobleman maneuvering for influence. He was, in many ways, invisible. His official role was papal master of ceremonies. That meant he was responsible for making sure papal rituals were performed correctly. Every candle lit at the right time, every robe draped in its proper place, every procession moving in perfect order. He was a man of detail, of precision. But what made Burchard extraordinary wasn't his job. It was what he chose to do alongside it. He kept a diary, not just any diary, but a meticulous, day-by-day record of life inside the Vatican, called the Liber Notarum. And here's the thing. This diary didn't only record the splendor of coronations or the majesty of holy festivals. It also captured the darker moments, the corruption, the scandals, the whispered sins that most men in his position would have ignored or concealed. And Burchard's style? It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't poetic. It was dry, almost clinical. Imagine an accountant balancing books, except instead of numbers, he was recording the excesses of the papal court. That's exactly why his work carries so much weight. He didn't embellish, he didn't moralize, he just wrote what he saw. And in doing so, he gave us a window into a Vatican that most people at the time could never have imagined. Now, think about the courage that took. He wasn't a powerful man. He wasn't untouchable. If the wrong person had discovered the depth of his notes, he could have been silenced forever. Yet Burchard kept writing. Year after year, pope after pope, from grand ceremonies to sordid scandals, he filled the pages with a record that no one else dared to keep. And it's because of Johannes Burchard that we know what happened on one of the darkest nights in Vatican history, the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts. He was there, not as a guest, not as a participant, but as part of his duty. The master of ceremonies had to be present at almost everything, in case a ritual or a formal duty was required. That very obligation placed him at the heart of a night that still shocks us 5 centuries later. Imagine him, standing in the corner of Cesare Borgia's lavish Vatican apartments. The walls around him were covered with frescoes, saints, classical gods, biblical scenes, all gazing down from painted ceilings as if silently judging what was about to unfold. Candlelight flickered across the floor, casting shadows that seemed to blur the line between the sacred and the profane. And then it began. 50 courtesans danced for cardinals, nobles, and ambassadors, at first clothed, then gradually shedding layers until nothing was left. Servants scattered chestnuts across the marble floor, and the women crawled on hands and knees to collect them in front of the Pope, his son Cesare, and even his daughter Lucrezia. Finally, competitions were held. Men were challenged to see who could couple with the most women. Prizes awarded as if human intimacy were nothing more than a sport. It sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? Like a lurid rumor invented to smear the papacy. But Burchard recorded it all, line by line, in his Liber Notarum. Not with outrage, not with exaggeration, simply with the cold eye of a witness writing down what no one else dared to say aloud. And because he did, the Banquet of Chestnuts could not be dismissed as rumor or propaganda. It was preserved in the Vatican's own secret archives, locked away for centuries because its contents were simply too scandalous to face. Here's the thought that gives me chills. Without Johannes Burchard, we might never have known the full depth of corruption that existed at the heart of the Church during Alexander VI's reign. The Borgias might have remained legends, their scandals brushed off as myths. But one man with a pen, quiet, disciplined, relentless, ensured the truth survived. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much of history do we actually know? How many scandals, abuses, or injustices have been lost simply because no one bothered or dared to write them down? And how different would our world look if every age had its own Johannes Burchard, someone willing to record reality exactly as it was, no matter how uncomfortable? The story of the Borgias is dramatic, filled with power, sex, betrayal, and ambition. But without Burchard, much of it would be invisible. His diary is the bridge between rumor and history. It's the reason we're still talking about the Banquet of Chestnuts, still trying to understand how the head of the Catholic Church could preside over something so depraved. In the end, Johannes Burchard wasn't a warrior, a pope, or a prince. He was a witness. And sometimes, being a witness, telling the truth when no one else will, is the most powerful act of all.
Let's step inside the Vatican on a night unlike any other, October 31st, 1501, All Hallows' Eve. Traditionally, a night when Christians remembered the dead, when the boundary between the sacred and the profane felt thinner than ever. But within Cesare Borgia's Vatican apartments, that boundary wasn't just thin, it was about to collapse completely. The setting was stunning, almost surreal. Cesare's chambers had been decorated with magnificent frescoes, scenes of classical gods alongside Christian saints, myth and scripture mingling on the walls. Imagine that for a moment. Apollo, Venus, Moses, and the Virgin Mary, painted side by side, silently looking down on what was about to unfold. The room was meant to glorify culture, faith, and beauty. But on this night, those painted figures became reluctant witnesses to something darker. The guest list alone revealed the weight of the evening. Cardinals in crimson robes, Roman nobles with their jeweled cloaks, foreign diplomats eager to gauge the Pope's power, and 50 courtesans, no ordinary women, but high-class, experienced entertainers who knew how to move in rooms where pleasure and politics walked hand in hand. The night began innocently enough, or at least as innocently as a papal banquet could. A lavish dinner was served, with delicacies and wines aged in Rome's finest cellars. Music floated through the chambers as guests laughed and exchanged polite conversation about politics, art, and conquest. But beneath that surface, the energy was shifting. As the plates were cleared, the entertainment began. At first, the courtesans danced gracefully in silks and velvets, their movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. But with each passing song, with each cup of wine poured, layers of fabric were shed. Slowly, the evening's mask of refinement slipped away, revealing something far more primal. Soon the women danced unclothed, their bodies shimmering in the glow of candlelight, and then came the chestnuts. Servants gathered the great candelabras from the tables and set them down on the marble floor, scattering their flickering light into pools of shadow. Chestnuts, simple roasted nuts, the kind peasants ate on autumn nights, were poured across the floor. The courtesans were instructed to crawl on hands and knees to collect them, their bodies illuminated by the dancing flames. Think about the symbolism. A fruit of the earth turned into a prop of humiliation and desire, right there in the heart of the Vatican. But the night wasn't finished shocking its audience. What followed was a competition, an obscene contest among the male guests. Who could couple with the greatest number of courtesans? Scores were kept. Prizes were offered. Fine silks, luxurious shoes, expensive hats. The sacred intimacy of human connection was reduced to a sport, a tally marked down as if it were a game of dice. And here's the detail that still haunts historians. Seated at the center of it all was Pope Alexander VI. Beside him, his son Cesare, and, disturbingly, his daughter Lucrezia. Whether she was a willing participant in her family's corruption or a victim trapped by circumstance, no one can say for certain. But her presence added a layer of scandal so deep that even centuries later, it remains hard to comprehend. The entire evening was recorded by Johannes Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, not in flowery prose, not in rumor, but with the same detached precision he used to describe a coronation. Line by line, he wrote it all down in his Liber Notarum. And then, for centuries, his account was sealed away in the Vatican's secret archives, too scandalous to see the light of day. Now, let's pause for a moment. Some of you might be thinking, could this really have happened? Could the Pope himself, the so-called Vicar of Christ, sit and watch such a spectacle?
Historians have debated it for years. Some Catholic writers argued the account was exaggerated or corrupted later. Protestant critics seized it as proof of papal depravity. But modern scholarship generally agrees on this. Whether embellished or not, the Banquet of Chestnuts reflects a truth about Alexander VI's reign. A truth of unchecked power, indulgence without restraint, and a Vatican more concerned with earthly pleasures than spiritual salvation. And here's what makes this story so powerful. It isn't just about one night of scandal. It's about what happens when power escapes all moral constraint. When leaders who are supposed to be guardians of faith turn faith into theater, politics into indulgence, and people into pawns.
The Banquet of Chestnuts wasn't just an orgy. It was a symbol of how far the papacy had strayed and why reformers across Europe, from fiery preachers like Savonarola to Martin Luther himself, would soon rise up demanding change. So the next time you hear the phrase, "power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely," remember this night in 1501. A night when chestnuts, scattered across the marble floors of the Vatican, became more than food. They became witnesses to the fall of dignity, to the collapse of sacred trust, and to the dangerous truth that even those who claim to hold the keys to heaven are still, at their core, only human.
When dawn broke over Rome on November 1st, 1501, the marble floors of the Vatican were clean again. The candles had burned out, the chestnuts were gone, and on the surface, life returned to normal. Pilgrims still filled St. Peter's Basilica, cardinals still held their councils, and Pope Alexander VI still appeared in public as if nothing had happened. But behind that mask of normalcy, the damage was already spreading. Servants whispered, guards gossiped. Diplomats who attended, or at least heard the rumors, sent letters back to their kings and courts. Before long, the scandal of the Banquet of Chestnuts had rippled across Europe, and what those letters described shocked even rulers who were no strangers to excess. Think about it. Kings and nobles of the Renaissance were used to decadence. They hosted feasts, they kept mistresses, they dabbled in power games. But the Pope, the man believed to be the vicar of Christ, the moral center of the Catholic world, that was different. If the Vatican itself had fallen into such depravity, what did that say about the Church's claim to spiritual authority? It was the perfect ammunition for critics. Preachers like Savonarola in Florence had already condemned the moral corruption of Rome. Now they had proof, or at least the story so powerful it didn't matter whether every detail was true. And only a few decades later, Martin Luther would nail his 95 Theses to the church door, demanding reform and pointing to scandals just like this one as evidence that the papacy was beyond saving. The Reformation wasn't born from the Banquet of Chestnuts alone, but nights like that made Luther's message hit harder. For Alexander VI himself, though, the scandal didn't bring remorse. If anything, it seemed to harden him. He doubled down on power, pouring more wealth and influence into his son Cesare's military campaigns. The Pope's vision was clear: a Borgia dynasty, carved out in the heart of Italy, with Cesare as its sword. Corruption continued as before. Indulgences sold, church offices bought, political marriages arranged like chess moves. But power built on scandal rarely lasts forever. In August 1503, Alexander VI suddenly fell ill and died, possibly from malaria. Though rumors of poisoning swirled through Rome, people whispered that he might have drunk from the wrong cup, a fate he had so often arranged for others. Whether disease or dagger, his death marked the collapse of the Borgia dream. Without his father's protection, Cesare's empire crumbled almost overnight. Enemies he once terrified now struck back. Within 4 years, the man Machiavelli admired as the model of the prince was dead, cut down not as a lord or commander, but as a mercenary soldier in Spain. A brutal, ironic end for someone who had once seemed unstoppable. And what of Lucrezia? She outlived them both. Married into the Este family, she became the Duchess of Ferrara. History remembers her differently depending on who tells the story. Some see her as a cunning manipulator, others as a victim of her father's and brother's ambition. Either way, her name would forever carry the shadow of the Borgia legacy, whispers of poison, incest, and scandal following her long after she tried to reinvent herself as a respected noblewoman. The scandal of the Banquet of Chestnuts didn't disappear with their deaths. It lived on in letters, in rumors, and most importantly, in Johannes Burchard's meticulous diary. Centuries later, when historians opened the Vatican's secret archives, they found his account, so shocking that even Pope Leo XIII hesitated to release it publicly. The fact that it was hidden for so long tells us just how damaging it was, even generations later. And here's where the story becomes more than just history.
Because what happened after 1501 wasn't just about the Borgias. It was about the church itself. The scandal damaged the credibility of the papacy in a way that couldn't be undone overnight. It fueled the growing fire of reform across Europe. It gave Protestants undeniable evidence to point at when they claimed the church had lost its way. and it forced future popes to make a choice: continue the path of indulgence and risk collapse, or embrace reform and discipline to save the institution. So let me ask you, if the Banquet of Chestnuts had never happened, if Alexander VI and his family had been less reckless, less indulgent, would the Reformation have gained the same force? Would Luther's criticisms have landed with the same impact? Or was history always going to bend that way, with or without the Borgias? What we do know is this: the Borgias left behind more than scandal. They left a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition, about how quickly power without restraint corrodes even the most sacred of institutions. And though 5 centuries have passed, that warning still feels uncomfortably relevant. The Borgias are gone. Their apartments are now tourist attractions, decorated with priceless art. The Chestnuts are long since swept away. But their story still lingers, reminding us how fragile trust is, and how quickly greatness can collapse when morality is sacrificed for power. So what are we to make of it all? The Banquet of Chestnuts wasn't just a wild party, it was the climax, the culmination of years of corruption festering at the very heart of the Catholic Church. A night where sacred vows and holy authority collapsed under the weight of greed, ambition, and desire. It was more than scandal. It was a symbol. At its core, the banquet embodied one of the great tensions of the Renaissance Church: the pull between spiritual authority and temporal power. The Pope was supposed to be the shepherd of souls, the moral guide for millions. But Alexander VI lived as if he were a king, or worse, a prince of indulgence. And on that autumn night in 1501, inside those frescoed apartments, the mask came off completely. The world saw not a spiritual father, but a man consumed by ambition, and a family drunk on power. The long-term consequences were immense. Scandals like the Banquet of Chestnuts fed a growing hunger for reform across Europe. They gave fiery preachers and critics all the evidence they needed to shout that the papacy had lost its way. And when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, he wasn't just challenging indulgences. He was challenging a culture of corruption that Alexander VI had come to symbolize. The Protestant Reformation changed the face of Christianity forever, and in many ways, the seeds of that revolution were watered by nights like this. The Catholic Church, too, eventually realized it had to respond. By the mid-1500s, the Council of Trent was called, ushering in the Counter-Reformation. New rules demanded stricter discipline, better education for priests, and an end, or at least a reduction, to some of the most blatant abuses. In a strange way, the very scandal that nearly destroyed the papacy helped force it to reform and survive. But how history remembers the Banquet of Chestnuts depends on who's telling the story. Protestant historians for centuries seized on it as proof that the papacy was rotten to the core. Catholic historians, understandably, often pushed back, questioning the accuracy of Johannes Burchard's account, suggesting exaggeration or later corruption of the text. And modern historians? They generally land somewhere in the middle. Most accept that the banquet happened, at least in its broad outline, but they also place it in context. Renaissance Italy was a world where politics, spectacle, and sensuality were woven together in ways that might shock us today, but weren't entirely alien to secular courts of the time. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. It's not just about one night of debauchery, it's about the contradictions of human nature, the sacred and the profane existing side by side. The same people who built soaring cathedrals, commissioned breathtaking works of art, and spoke of divine salvation also presided over nights that stripped away dignity, then mocked the very faith they claimed to defend. If there's a lesson here, it's one that reaches far beyond the Vatican of 1501. The Banquet of Chestnuts reminds us what happens when power goes unchecked. When leaders stop serving a higher calling and instead serve only themselves, corruption doesn't just destroy individuals, it corrodes institutions, undermines trust, and leaves legacies that last for centuries. And yet, there's also something universal in the story. Because aren't we all in some way caught between the sacred and the profane? Between our higher ideals and our baser desires? The Borgias, in all their excess, simply lived that contradiction on the grandest and most scandalous stage possible. Today, the rooms where the banquet took place no longer echo with laughter or scandal. They're adorned with art,
admired by tourists who may not even realize the shadows those walls once held.
But the memory endures, carried not just in dusty archives but in the warnings of history itself. The Banquet of Chestnuts was more than an orgy, it was a turning point. A moment when the papacy's credibility cracked under the weight of its own corruption, forcing the Church and indeed all of Europe to grapple with the consequences. And as we look back across 5 centuries, perhaps the real significance of that night lies not in the chestnuts scattered on the marble floor, but in what they represent, the fragile line between greatness and ruin, between faith and hypocrisy, between the power to lead and the temptation to fall. The candles of that night burned out long ago. The people are dust in Roman graves, but their story still speaks. It warns us, challenges us, and reminds us that history is not just about what happened. It's about what keeps happening when power is left without conscience.